in which he argues that for a variety of legal and also sociological reasons that hate crimes are both unnecessary and undesirable. And that is what he's going to be arguing in front of us today as well. He'll probably speak for about half an hour plus or minus, and he'd be happy to take questions and have some discussion afterwards. So do be thinking of things that you would like to ask him. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Jacobs.
Thank you. Well, I thank Ruben, and I thank the Federalist Society. I've done quite a few visits around the country to Federalist Society chapters in the last several years. I've always enjoyed them, and I think the Federalist Society has really added a lot to the intellectual life and energy of American legal institutions. And it's a pleasure to be participating again and to be here at this great university. I'll try to outline the argument I presented in my book in about a half an hour's time, and then take your comments and questions. This is a topic that you don't really have to energize people on. People, already have very strong and sometimes passionate feelings about it. First, let's be clear on what our hate crimes laws are about. Mostly, they come in a couple of different categories, but we're mostly talking about sentencing enhancements. When these laws started out to be proposed, it was actually in the late 1980s, and we didn't have any kind of hate crime laws or even the term hate crime until the mid to late 1980s. So it's a comparatively recent phenomenon. And now practically all states have these enhancements for crimes that are motivated in whole or in part by certain disfavored prejudices on the usual categories of race and religion, and then more controversially, as I'll explain in a minute, gender, and even more controversially, sexual preference, and then other categories that have been added one after another. There's another kind of hate crime law, substantive kind of hate crime law. Some places it's an aggravated harassment law, where you prove the aggravated harassment by proving the disfavored prejudice. But for the most part, I'm focusing on sentencing enhancements. So my first real question for you to think about, and which I want to think about a bit with you, is why did this happen in the late 1980s? Why do we need sentence enhancements for crimes motivated by certain disfavored prejudices? Well, I'd start out by saying that there is no criminological answer to explain that. There wasn't a crime problem that required this wave of new laws, and there wasn't a criminal justice system absence of ability to respond to crime that required these new laws. So first, even though there were claims in the late 1980s and early 1990s about an epidemic of hate crime, in my effort to explore the data on this, I found no evidence of an epidemic of hate crime. If anything, I found over the course of the 20th century, happily enough, a diminution of crimes based upon intolerance. I don't need to remind you of the lynchings that went on in the early 20th century, and horrible kinds of crimes, the gay bashing that went on, and much more prevalently than now. So I didn't see any anti-Semitic crimes. I think in general, we have become at least I would take this position, a more tolerant society over the course of the 20th century. Of course, that's to be applauded, but it is not a headline. It is not a headline that sells newspapers, and not a headline that many people like to embrace for reasons maybe you can think of better than I. People like to think more about how bad things are than how good things are. Most crime, as you may know, most crime with victims is intraracial crime. Right? So we have to kind of have that kind of criminological background in our mind. When people are aggressing against each other violently, it's overwhelmingly intraracial and intra-group. So take African American victims of homicide, for example. Over 90% have been victimized by other African Americans. So this leaves 10% for victimizations by members of other groups. And similarly, when you're talking about white Caucasian victims of homicides, it's a little bit lower, maybe 80%. The perpetrator was of the same Caucasian group, and the rest from minority groups. Where we have intergroup aggression, overwhelmingly, it involves the case of men aggressing against women. And, you know, here we can open up a huge topic of whether we ought to be thinking about domestic violence and all kinds of violence by men against women as hate crime. And if we do, should that be punished more severely than a crime committed by a woman against a man, or a man against a man, or a woman against a woman, and so forth. But it was not gender motivated crime that generated the movement in hate crime laws in the late 80s and the early 90s, and it's still not. When it's still not on the radar screen when people talk about hate crime, they're not really thinking about domestic violence and battered women and so forth. Even when we arrest people for intergroup crimes, whether interracial crimes or anti-Semitic crimes, anti-gay and lesbian crimes, overwhelmingly the people who are arrested are young offenders. So we're talking about people, say, between the ages of 16 and 20 or 22. And these are generally speaking, people with previous arrest records and previous involvements with the criminal law and the juvenile system. So these are messed up kids, messed up teenagers. They may well be prejudiced. Their prejudices may shift around from time to time, but what I just want to make the point, I mean, they're not part of the neo-Nazi party. They don't have an ideology. Some of them are anti-Semites who know nothing, for example, about Jews or Judaism or what it means. They just, there's some people there and they're dressed funny and let's go get them. But they don't have any kind of deep-seated program of attacking a minority religious group. The second major point I'd want to make about there being no crime issue here is that this conduct that is captured by hate crime laws is already criminal. And we love criminal law in the United States. I love criminal law. I've made an entire career and living on it. And the more of it, the better. But, you know, here, this is a really funny phenomenon to think about, is that we're dealing with conduct already a crime, and then in these hate crime laws, we're going through the criminal code and recriminalizing, in a sense, and punishing. I mean, we've exhausted all the different kinds of conduct that could be reachable. So, I mean, this isn't like new conduct, you know, in a way like affirmative action programs in employment aiming at certain kinds of prejudice or hostile workplace or something like that. This is already criminal activity. We're just going through and giving it a star, you know, under certain circumstances. And that leads me to say that there was no reason to do this. I mean, it would be a very hard proposition for somebody to carry that, you know, American sentencing law is inadequate, you know, to deal with a whole species of crime. We just don't take crime seriously enough. We don't have our maximum sentences pegged high enough so that we need, you know, to expand our punishment apparatus. I mean, quite the contrary, as is frequently pointed out, especially in legal academia, we have extremely tough sentencing laws, probably the toughest sentences in the Western world. There is adequate punishment machinery, at least in my view, and probably in most of your views, to punish every conceivable crime. It would be very hard to go through the criminal code and the sentencing code, your state or my state, say, you know, this really isn't being treated seriously enough. I mean, if we have a problem in the criminal justice system today, it looks like we're punishing too many people too harshly for too long, and it is constantly an issue about how can we reduce sentences, how do we get people out of jail and out of prison, and usually it's the liberal elites that are right on top of that. So there is an irony here that it is the liberal elites who have kind of pushed these hate crime laws and more punishment. And I'll say this again at the end, but it bears emphasizing that the ultimate irony in this increased punishment is that the sentencing enhancement laws for hate crimes led to more death penalty laws. So that in other words, when there's a murder, and you can show that the motivation for it was one of the disfavored prejudices, then that kicks it into capital murder. And in order to respond appropriately to that kind of a murder, the death penalty is required or is added. So we have harsh sentencing laws, we have 3 strikes laws, we have 2 strikes laws, we have 1 strike laws, we have all kinds of add-ons, and I think that the main challenge for us in legal academia and criminal law is to try to calm this system down and quiet it down and realize that we can't find answers to all of our problems in more punishment. So something else must be going on here. I mean, if it's not the number of crimes and it's not some weakness in the criminal justice system, what has led to this wave of hate crime laws? And I think really that this really the explanation here is the triumph of the toleration movement in the United States. Is that we are we're riding a tidal wave of energy towards creating a more tolerant society. And we've made a lot of strides in that direction. And I think the hate crime laws were part of the momentum of this, is carrying forward the project of tolerance building from the employment context and the educational context and other mainstream contexts into the criminal law. So it was a kind of marrying of affirmative action to criminal law. It was a way for the advocacy groups to rally their troops. No advocacy group wants to say, you know, the problem is pretty well solved. It's pretty much better. No, I mean, I think the position is going to be we are under attack. We are more vulnerable than ever. We need your support. We need your money. We need your membership and dues, and we, there's an epidemic of violence against us all over. There's, the enemies are at the gates, and we need support. And what we can produce is more law. We can produce law is the product of advocacy groups. More victimhood means more support, that more support is required. In addition, these hate crime laws were a very easy win for politicians. I mean, nothing could make a politician happier than to be able to come out in full blast support of laws punishing racist and homophobic and anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic and so forth criminals. I mean, this isn't controversial, except in the area of anti-homophobic, which I'll say something about in a moment. But to stand up and righteously say, what am I going to do? I'm going to punish, the racists and the other bigots and haters in the society. Will punish them into oblivion, and no one stands with the victimized groups more than I do. Well, that's great, and there's nobody on the other side. I mean, nobody stands up and say, "Well, I'm actually with the violent guys that are knocking off people." I mean, there's no political constituency for that. And I have in my book all kinds of great quotes, from politicians. Nobody is more, on the side of the groups and so on. So I think that's going on. No opposition, easy win for politicians. It costs nothing, but of course it does nothing as well. And maybe politicians like it for that reason as well. I think this is a misapplication of the affirmative action paradigm. First of all, it doesn't do anything for the victims. In other areas of affirmative action, where we've looked at groups that have been historically discriminated against and victimized, we've helped in the job area, and we've helped in breaking through color barriers in unions. For example, we've done things on admission to educational opportunity. But here in the criminal law area, all we can do for victims under this paradigm is punish the perpetrator more. And that really doesn't add anything, at least anything tangible, for the victims. I mean, in fact, one could ask, should victims be bought off in that way, that we're going to punish the perpetrator more? Maybe the victim should say, look, we would like some victims' benefits, some help in getting ourselves past these unhappy events. In addition, in the usual affirmative action paradigm, we're dealing with a power structure dominated by the white male majority, having excluded members of a powerless or a much less powerful minority, and trying to open doors for that minority. That's not the paradigm in crime, right? This crime problem is not some dominant, majority beating up on some minority. In fact, the minorities do quite well, thank you, in committing crimes themselves. And in fact, it's really the powerless members of both groups, who are most involved in, at least in the violent crime area. And while we don't have a lot of employment discrimination by African Americans against Caucasians, we do have in the crime area just as much violence by African Americans and other minority groups against Caucasians, against other minorities, also, right? Hispanics and blacks and Asians and so forth, as we do the majority group against the minority groups, and the hate crime laws have come to be used in those contexts as well. So it has a kind of counter effect, higher punishments for some minority offenders. And in addition, we're talking about more imprisoning, more punishing of certain offenders, basically younger, messed up offenders. And if the idea is that this more punishing will lead to a more tolerant society, I mean, it's very questionable, especially given the state of the prisons as a cauldron of intolerance. I mean, you wanted to look for a place where people don't treat each other nicely and are not respectful of each other's backgrounds and traditions. Jails and prisons, I would say, would be a good place to start. You've got the most messed up people from all groups in there under conditions of intense deprivation, and at least for the people who are sent there, they probably don't come out of the experience better people and more tolerant people. This movement towards the hate crime laws politicizes crime. It takes an issue or a phenomenon that used to bring us together. So everybody with their heads screwed on right as opposed to crime, especially the worst kinds of crime. We could all denounce crime and criminals. This would be a consensus building area and allows us to politicize that area and to fight about it. And now we can turn something that was a consensus builder into something that is a dissensus builder. So we can now fight about crime. Whose crime against who is really more serious, and isn't my victimization more serious than your victimization, and so forth. And I want a statement, and I want it admitted. No, you can't. Yes, you can. And so we can turn this into a field of battle along the usual fault lines of American society. And I think that's dysfunctional and sad rather than some kind of an achievement. I think it creates a distortive picture of the United States if we try to tease out as much of the prejudice as we can in our crime problem, see it as a kind of a subset of our race problems and our sexual identity problems and religious differences, and to understand ourselves as a society based upon inferences that we are drawing from the criminality of the least successful, least impressive members of the society. I mean, I think that's a very poor way to judge American society and to judge where we stand. I mean, I think the right focus is to focus on our elites and our leaders and those who set examples and lead, and see where they are, and see that is what we should take as setting our understanding of where we are as a society, not kind of interviewing our criminals and asking, what kind of prejudices do these criminals have, and then extrapolating and saying this only shows that the whole society is breeding these kinds of people. That, of course, would trigger I think, the lessons of the prosecution of the Duke lacrosse players, which riveted the nation, and which I think fits well into this topic today. I think that the hate crime law movement is undesirable because it takes something that was a consensus builder and gives us a dissensus builder, something else to fight about. And we can fight about whose victimization is worse. And this is, kind of the reaction I often get, but isn't it worse? Isn't it worse? Isn't it worse? I don't know. There's a lot of, most crime is bad. That's why it's a crime. I don't know that we need to go to the next step as to which crimes are worse, which kind of victimizations are worse. Those are sometimes hard questions to answer. We're all agreed that crime should be punished, and we do punish crime pretty well. It's not something we have a problem with in this society. Our problem may be in punishing it too well. We could fight about who should be included in the definition of hate crime. In other words, what kind of prejudices. And we have seen that, especially in the area of gays and lesbians, who said, "Well, wait a minute. There's a whole tradition of gay bashing in the country, and that ought to be punished more than a normal bashing." And you had politicians saying, "Wait a minute. We're not going to do that. We're talking about bona fide bad prejudices and prejudices against homosexuality. That's not a really bad prejudice, and if we were to include that kind of prejudice in the hate crime laws, we would be legitimating gays and lesbians as a bona fide excluded group, or within the paradigm of affirmative action." And the answer to that was, yeah, well, that's what all this is about. This is a way of making that point. We ought to be included that way because of what happens in the crime area. And yeah, I mean, that was a good point. And a lot of legislatures and Congress itself originally excluded gays and lesbians from this paradigm, which was itself like a hate crime, right? I mean, the leadership excludes violence against prejudice, violence based upon prejudice, based upon sexual identity as a hate crime, but includes other kinds. I mean, this is bound to disillusion and embitter people. But that has changed over the time, and in most that I know of, hate crime laws include gays and lesbians. Prejudice against gays and lesbians. Gender was another area where there was a lot of fighting, and you had the original proponents of hate crime laws said, well, wait a minute, crimes by men against women, that's not what we mean by hate crime. That's not based upon prejudice against a group. That's based upon dislike of an individual. So that shouldn't count. I said, what? What? How do you know that? I mean, it's not, what motivates people what motivates a man to beat up a woman? You don't think it's not based upon general bad attitudes and prejudices against women, or based on gender? That looks like raw hypocrisy to me. It was also true in the area of crimes by minorities against whites. It's a crime in the subway. And the original advocates said, well, that's not what we mean by hate crime. We said, well, this guy always seems to pick out whites, this particular offender. That's not hate crime, that's acquisitive crime. So this became more confusing all the time, and builds charges of hypocrisy and feeds into this battle of identity politics. I think it distorts resources so that we are building up in our police departments, in our prosecuting areas, units to deal with hate crime where there's not need to do that. And of course, there was a whole movement to pass a federal hate crime law to make it a federal crime, right? Not only, is this an epidemic? Not only are the laws not serious enough, but the states and localities cannot handle it. This is out of control. Only your federal government can come in and prosecute these intergroup crimes. Of course, that's all symbolic politics. The federal criminal justice apparatus is not of the size that it could take on more maybe than a symbolic couple of cases like that per year. There's really no demonstration that the states and localities weren't able or weren't willing to deal with such cases. This push for a federal hate crime law, came and was generated by and was energized by the Matthew Shepard murder in Wyoming. You remember the gay young man who was brutally murdered. He was immediately, the perpetrators were arrested. They were charged with capital murder. The criminal justice system seemed to be right on top of this in Wyoming. The victim's parents said they didn't believe in the death penalty. The prosecutor said he was acceding to their wishes and would accept a plea to murder without the death penalty. Case closed, but it seemed to generate a great push that we needed a federal crime to bring the FBI in, to bring the federal prosecutors in to deal appropriately with these cases. I think that we don't use these hate crime laws very much. I think they're meant to be admired, not to be used. I mean, they don't really play a role in the criminal justice system because there's not a need for them to play a role. But if they were to be used, they would clearly strain the jury system. It makes you think about the predicates upon which a jury system is built, that people in such a diverse society could be convened in a criminal trial and told to put aside whatever prejudices they have, whatever dislikes and likes they have, and just deal with a question: did A hit B over the head? Did A steal money from B? And not get distracted, right? And normally, when people are distracted by other kinds of issues, it's usually brought in by the defense. The prosecution is really trying to say it's a simple case. We got to get unanimous verdict. We got to get people from all walks of life willing to agree on guilt in order to get a conviction. If you get people to start to think that this really isn't about A hitting B on the head. This is really a political trial. This is really about one group making claims against another group, then maybe some of those jurors will start to say, my allegiance is with my group. This has raised my consciousness about group conflict, and the facts are less important than the politics. So it gives you a flavor of my critique of the hate crime laws. In the final analysis, I don't think we can punish our way into being a more tolerant society. We've got to find other ways and make real investments and do the work of tolerance building, and just waving the banner of punishment and prison and capital punishment, I think is the wrong way to go.
Thank you very much. We do have time for questions if anybody would like to ask anything of questions.
I'd like to ask your opinion on another way of thinking about why hate crime legislation might be needed. If certain crimes are committed with the purpose of perpetuating kind of terror in a community and making people feel scared to go out or go certain places, probably analogous with cross burning. That kind of, one of the reasons we punish terrorism harder than murder is because we think it's a threat to people who aren't affected by the crime itself. I was wondering what your critique is of that argument for hate crime legislation.
Yeah, well, my critique is that a lot of kinds of crime radiate, through the society, depending upon whether the media picks them up and they get publicized. But if you hear about a crime in your local park, it has an impact on people's use of the park. It frightens people away. And if you hear about a school shooting in some other place, it affects people's attitudes towards school. So I think a lot of different kinds of crime, radiate broad effects, and they not all intergroup crime radiates those kinds of effects, and most of the crimes that are picked up by the hate crime laws don't involve a kind of genocidal, agenda. Where we want to wipe this group, off the face of the earth. They involve young people. Of a fight, there may be a girl involved, there may be turf involved, there may be gangs involved, and then it's kind of the larger society that's putting it in a particular frame. Finally, the crimes that cause the most anxiety in the society are murders, and rapes and brutal beatings, right? I mean, that's what, and those crimes already are punishable by life imprisonment or capital punishment. There's nothing more that we can do, short of breaching the torture, line. There's no more punishment. Now, some states have, especially Texas, I don't know what's done in North Carolina. One thing they've done is that they sentence people to hundreds of years of imprisonment. They don't stop at a natural lifetime, 50 years. They go to 300. People get punishments like 300 years, 600 years of imprisonment. I mean, that's kind of a symbolic response. But where the hate crime laws, if they were going to have an effect, they would have an effect more on low-level offenses where you could do more, where there was some room at the top. So when I was writing my book, I looked at the New York Criminal Code. I saw that for vandalism, our maximum punishment is 4 years. That seems like a lot for vandalism. For graffiti, it was 1 year in prison. Now, you might say, look, if the graffiti carries a really message like all X's leave the country, leave the state, you're not welcome here, maybe you should be punished more than 1 year. My reading of that is that the sentencing laws are completely adequate, and if there's a problem, which I think there is a problem, the sentences are too high, and our sentences need to be scaled back. We have under our present system 2.1 million people in prison or jail on any given day in the United States. That's larger than the combined populations of Vermont, Wyoming, and Alaska combined. I mean, sort of think about that. That is an American gulag, right? And you might ask yourself, well, what have we achieved by that? Well, we may have achieved some decent results, but we've also achieved a big problem, like 600,000 people a year coming out of prison with that, having had that experience. So I'm always, reluctant to see more punishment, longer punishments as a solution to a problem. It also causes problems. Sorry, that's such a long-winded answer, but I'm all wound up on this.
It seems that your objections to hate crimes laws are policy-based, that you can't legislate someone's morality, that they just don't dissuade people from committing crimes. Do you believe that there are any legitimate constitutional arguments, against federal constitutional arguments against hate crime laws?
Well, some of them, I think, violate the First Amendment, and some of them were struck down as violative of the First Amendment. That RAV versus St. Paul, one of the early hate crime laws, was struck down in that way. And we are, in those laws, picking and choosing certain prejudices as being hate crime triggers and not other prejudices. The courts have mostly upheld that, but I think that there are First Amendment issues there. And if it doesn't violate the letter of the Constitution, I think it puts pressure on the spirit of the First Amendment for no good reason. One thing you can be sure of is that people who are punished under these laws will understand, will come to argue and believe that they are First Amendment martyrs. That if they're sitting in prison punished for a hate crime act, and they're being punished twice as much or 3 times as much, as someone else, then they're going to think that this is all about politics. This is all about violation of certain disfavored views. One of the interesting cases in this area is I forgot the name of Wisconsin. Somebody may remember this. You have the black youth who went to the movie Mississippi Burning and came out, and they said, all energized by the movie and saying, there's a white kid over there, let's go get him. And they go over and they beat him up, and they're punished 3 times as much under the statute as they would have been otherwise. There's a lot of examples in my book of people in a campground turn down the music, no, go to hell, yeah, you dirty X, why do you say that, bang, bang, and they were punching each other out, then they get arrested and charged with one of these hate crime enhancement statutes because of what they said. You could avoid all of, any risk of being punished as a hate crime offender just by keeping your mouth shut. Right? And if you're a highly sophisticated hater, right, then, you can go about your business surreptitiously without announcing your motivation.
Yeah.
Display a reluctance to treat crimes of the same type differently, based on, saying which one is worse and one of these is less bad. And I'm wondering if you don't think that judges and juries do that
already. And within that, one would think that a racist murderer is less sympathetic than a non-racist murderer. And if you think that judges and juries treat people differently now, do you think that there should be anything to try to counteract that, or a jury instruction, or that sort of thing, or are you okay with the system as it is?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and a lot of this may go on anyway, kind of under the radar, because we have these huge maximum sentences, and a judge may say, look, this was carried out for horrific reasons, prejudice reasons, and I'm sentencing you to the maximum. I think that's more okay when it's done by a judge under the existing laws, and we don't have to, have legislated this into the law. I think it will create less disputes and less fracturing. Right. Mostly, it's not up to the juries. It'll mostly be up to the judges, right? Or maybe the judge could put it a different way and say, I sometimes in cases like this am reluctant to sentence to the maximum. You're a young person, so forth. But in your case, I don't see any reason for mitigation. Right? But if you left it to me and said, if I were the judge on pure prejudice grounds, would I sentence the prejudiced criminal to a greater sentence than the non-prejudiced criminal? I don't think so. I don't think so. And if I did, I would really look hard at which prejudices I was favoring and which ones I was just ignoring. It would be hard to give a mitigation, I think, to a highly prejudiced, racist, homophobic, really, anti-Semitic offender. They wouldn't look very attractive, that's for sure.
Anybody else?
Thank you. Thank you for having me.